Like most of the hourglass, these are the songs of our lives. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Songs of Our Lives. I'm Brad Rose. I am a musician, a composer, a writer, the founder of Foxy Digitalis, and somebody who thinks about music and sound far more than is healthy. Each week I invite on a guest and we talk about the songs and the music that has meant a lot to them and been with them along their journey. Previous guests include Matt Sage, Shane Parrish, Jalen, Claire Rousset, Ilyas Ahmed. The list goes on. The list goes on and on and on. Before I get to this week's guest, just want to remind you that if you enjoy this podcast and listen to these episodes on a regular basis, it'd be awesome if you can leave a rating and or a review on whatever service you use to stream them. That kind of thing helps other people discover it. And if you really, really, really like it, you can support it for as little as $3 a month on Patreon, patreon.com/FoxyDigitalis. You get the full conversation and you get it a week early, plus a bunch of other stuff, depending on what level you support at. But mainly, especially, thanks for listening. So, my guest this week is a legend, an absolute legend. I've been trying to get Lawrence English on one of the various Foxy Digitalis realm podcasts for a while, and I'm so glad it finally came together this way. Lauren, I don't feel like Lawrence needs any introduction. He's done so much amazing solo work, collaborative work. Room 40 is one of the great labels of modern times, I would say. I mean, and I'm totally biased. I've had 2 albums on Room 40, so putting that out there, but I think that's a pretty objective statement that it's one of the great labels. And this kind of coincides with a new collaborative album he has with Akira Kosemura called Selene, which is out on temporary residence on May 31st. So by the time you hear this, it should be out. And yeah, I don't know. Lawrence is, as I say in the intro, like he is all these things. And to me, he is also a friend. And one of the great things about doing this episode is it's a pretty long episode, but there's about 30 or 45 minutes that we just were catching up and talking about life experiences and all the stuff we do before I even hit record. And those kind of things, as I'm sure you all know with your friends and compatriots and all those things, those moments mean the world. So I can't say enough good things about Lawrence. He's a legend. What can we say? Lawrence English is a legend. So we recorded this a couple weeks ago. Like I said, it was an amazing time. Thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoy this. My guest today is a musician, a composer, curator, a label boss, a collaborator. I could probably keep listing things, but maybe most importantly, at least to me, my friend, it is Lawrence English for the show.
Such a pleasure to be here, Brad. Thank you for having me.
So this record with Akira Kosemura, is it Selene? Is that the right pronunciation?
Selene. Yeah, it is.
So tell me about it. How long have you guys been working on it? How did this come about?
Well, I've known Akira for a really long time, actually. Like, Akira was, in fact, basically the reason that we started the Someone Good label, which is kind of one of the sibling Room 40 labels, like the Room 40 label family, I like to call it. But Akira sent us this record called It's on Everything. And this would have been like 2005, 2006, something like that. And I remember getting it, and it came on a CD, because in those days, people sent CDs in the mail.
Yeah.
And I was playing it, and Bex, my partner, was like, "That's really good." I was like, "Yeah, it is pretty good, right?" And she was like, "Yeah, it's really good." And at that point, like Room 40 was kind of pretty focused on really experimental stuff, largely. I mean, some ambient work as well, but you know, Akira, just by the way that he works, is he's a very melodic player, and he kind of crafts these very just beautifully structured compositional songs. Really, at the end of the day, like they have this kind of way in them that's really specific to him. So I've been kind of thinking about this other label idea, which I didn't really have any kind of like form for. I knew that I wanted it to be something that was sort of sitting in parallel, something that Room 40 wasn't really occupied with. And I was spending a lot of time in Japan at that point. So anyway, like basically it's on everything sort of spurred someone good to go on, which basically the line was, who's putting your record out? Well, someone good is. And then like that was the boom boom. But so since then, Akira and I have been in touch a bunch. We worked together. I helped make some of the field recordings that guided the Polaroid piano record that he made. That was a really beautiful record. And yeah, along the way, we sort of a few times been like, oh, we should do like a more developed project. And probably I'm to blame. I'm so slow. We started probably seriously talking about this what feels like a decade ago. But then in just before COVID, we started sharing some more materials, and we started working on it. And then like 2/3 of it was sort of done, maybe like a couple of years ago. And then I just sort of sat on it for a little while because I thought, oh, there's something else in here that I just want to try and tease out. And that's kind of where the rest of the sort of form and structure came from. And then I sort of, we exchanged some more materials and the record kind of took shape really quite quickly after that. But there's just something about that. It's that sometimes things need to, like slow cooking is real. There's a
Yeah,
reason that slow cooked food tastes so good.
right.
And I am totally good. I'm with taking time for something to be better. I'm a true believer in right place, right time, and I think Selene is the kind of result of that.
Yeah,
Percolation.
yeah. No, I relate to that a lot. I things are going to happen when they need to happen. Like I don't, especially with projects like this. I mean, we've all been there. We've all done where maybe we forced something a little bit or pushed it faster than it needed to go, and it couldn't, But yeah, the slow cook is the best cook.
Absolutely, I think so, and I mean, it does. It also just it allows the. I mean, I'm interested in ideas ultimately at the end of the day, and it
Hmm.
allows ideas to kind of take shape in a way that is actually developed and not like a. I mean, I appreciate the idea of like improvisation and things being instantaneous, and I absolutely appreciate that as like a kind of way of approaching, work, I guess. But I do like when you can sit with an idea and let the conceptual part play out as much as the musical part. And for me, conceptual part's a big part of what I'm interested in when I'm making music. Like I can't just pull it out of the air. I struggle with that. What I love to have is a really tight frame that then everything kind of has to go into. So it's instead of it being like a sort of horizontal, it becomes like a vertical way of thinking about music where you're just going deeper into the idea. And at the same time, that interrogation brings out something sonically.
Yeah, God, that is it's funny that because there's the horizontal versus the vertical thing, like a project that I've been working on that's finally almost done. Um, and I was been finishing up the score for it, which is like this graphic score, and it is a project that is had a very tight like frame, like conceptual framework and stuff. And as I was working on the score, I ended up turning it so that it reads vertically because that
Uh-huh.
felt it felt like how this particular project was. So I like that description.
Yeah, I think it's a really valid way to think about at least from my perspective, a really valid way to think about how it is that you approach that process of composition. And I think composition, like in a sort of longitudinal sense in your life, because I think there are moments where the ideas are really uh, fresh and they can be really spontaneous. But at a certain point, you it's not necessarily that you exhaust those things, but that maybe your threshold for what is satisfying and what's important in your practice begins to rise. And that's where that idea of kind of verticality becomes really important if you want to sustain your interest in making work.
Mm-hmm. So is that, speaking of collaboration, you've had a number of collaborative records come out in the last couple of years. It's been, there's the Law School one, there's the David Toop record, which is maybe my favorite. There's some Merzbow record. Anyway, like when you're sort of looking or deciding to work on a collaborate, like what draws you to?
I mean, it's interesting. Those three are ones that are really kind of have been sort of floating around for a long time. Like, I mean, we joke. With David, for example, we've been part of records together in groups, or there was a record we did with Akio Suzuki, which we recorded in 2013, which just sort of sat basically on a hard drive for a decade. And we recorded together. In fact, David was one of the first people I played with in the early 2000s. We did a record called "The Picturesque View Ignored." It was me, David, Scanner, and two other musicians, Heinz Riegler and Tam Patton, who were in this kind of trio. And on and off over the years, I played with David quite a few times, but never actually committed to making a record. And I think, for me, what I'm interested in when it comes to collaboratorial work is like for that time that you're working together, it's like you are getting to hear the possibility for work through someone else's ears. It's the same thing I like about field recording. Great field recordings is like you are tapping into someone else's listening for just that period of the time that you're listening to the field recording. And I find collaboration is like that. I always learn something new, whether it's like a technical skill or it's a way of approaching work or a way of thinking about how work can occur, like how music occurs. And with David, it was like extraordinary because, I'd literally, and it was actually the same with Scott. I'd develop these materials and then something would come back from that and I would hear something in a wholly different way. And sometimes there's another process of passing things back and forth again, but other times it was just like complete, like David, the record with David was really great because I got to record a bunch of things I would never otherwise do. Like I went back to a kind of improvised sound practice that I really haven't been actively engaged in since, 2005.
Oh,
and
wow.
I really enjoyed it. And I'm thinking about it more as I'm thinking to return to some of that work again.
Yeah.
Because it's challenging. And when you have a collaborator or someone that you're performing with that is also really listening and open to that situation, what can be so fragile and so right on the edge of possibility. It's just amazing to have that sensation. And it was, in a similar way with someone like Scott, he's such a great listener in a musical way. And the shows that we played, these tours that we did the last 6 months, actually, honestly, they were a delight. I mean, one, because, he's one of the few people at 7 o'clock in the morning at the airport, I can bitch about the coffee and he's not going to look at me like, please don't bitch about the coffee. But I can bitch about coffee anywhere with that guy and he'll happily listen to my bitching. So I'm very grateful. And that, I would say, is also one of the true pleasures of collaboration is the friendship part of it. And,
yeah,
I'm living here at the bottom of the world. So I take that very seriously because I realize that sometimes many years can go by before I get to see people again. And weirdly now, I'm really, really conscious of that because this year alone, like I've lost let's say within the last year, I've lost a lot of good friends. And I mean, just the other day, I have it right behind me here. I had this book that Phil Niblock gave me when I saw him for the last time in London last year, and I was just looking at it, and I remember I was there with Thurston Moore, who was playing, and Thurston got his book signed. I thought, that's a great idea. I'm going to get Phil to sign my book. So I got the book out and
Oh
asked him to
man.
sign it. I'm so happy that I got him to sign it now. Like, I
Yeah.
never do that. But it's such a lovely thing to have and to think about that memory. So, yeah, that's a big part of it for me as well. I love the interaction with people. I like that sharing that happens in collaboration in a way that maybe you don't get in other parts of your life.
Yeah. God. I mean, I don't live at the bottom of the world, but I live somewhat in the middle of nowhere. And so that resonates really deeply with me. That's like a big part of collaboration for me is just, yeah, making new friends, like lifelong friends most of the time. And
Yeah.
and learning, so I mean, I think of how much if I ever try to think about like where my practice would be without the people I've collaborated with, it's just terrifying.
Yeah, no, it's really true. I mean, thinking about the record with Merzbow, I mean, I learned so much during that one and the record,
man.
the Hexa collaboration I had, we did with Jamie
Yeah.
and Army. Like, those records taught me so much about how sound can coexist in a really sort of like technical sense, because, Merzbow has such an absolute force in the music. It was really interesting to try and think about, well, actually, where do you fit in a situation like that? And that's why I think why I was so satisfied with that Eternal Stalker record, the Strugatsky tribute of sorts. Like that record has a sense of space, and I think Masami is really satisfied with that sense of space that existed between these really extreme full-bodied sounds and then things that are almost like reductive versions of that situation, where they still feel really dense, but they're maybe more singular somehow.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And quickly talking about Phil, I will ever be grateful that you hooked Phil and I up for the sort of a precursor with this podcast, an interview, and getting to talk to Phil for an hour a couple of years ago. God, like I'm so glad
you did.
that, yeah, amazing. And and it was recorded, and it's like this document that exists, and it's just Phil and his element being Phil.
Yeah, and look, that's the thing that becomes important about. I mean, actually, this series that you're doing, it's a really good example of it. Like, so much of the history goes undocumented in a way, and like the ideas that surround things and the stories and whatever. And like I've been really conscious of that with Room 40, and obviously it's a little bit off topic, but like, the books and the editions we've done with like David Toop and Anea Lockwood. There was a kind of digital version with Alan Licht. I mean, those long form kind of in conversations are a way of just trying to capture some of that, because so much of it disappears. And I've actually been reaching out to a bunch of different artists, like doing interviews again, actually, because I want to try and capture some of those stories. And I mean, it's slow going. Some of them take a long time to land, but like when they come through, it's actually really great to know that they're there, and you can kind of hold on to those little bits of history that would otherwise vanish into thin air.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a big part of like doing this show. Part of it is just it's an excuse to have fun conversations with cool people, but a lot of it too is it's like you really learn other parts of people's story that doesn't really exist in a lot of places. And so those are things that are really important for me to document. And yeah, someday, like if I ever win the lottery or something, I'm going to pay someone to transcribe all of them to put it in a book. I hate transcribing, and I'm so slow at it.
It's a thing to do, for sure.
Yeah. So, well, okay. Speaking of the show, we're 20 minutes in here, and we haven't even started. No, it's good.
Songs.
Hey, this is how it goes. It's my show. I get to do what I want.
Yeah, exactly. You just command it. Whatever you want, I'm right here.
But we're gonna get into it, then we'll see where it goes. But we're gonna start, as always, with what is the first song that you remember?
Yeah, this was interesting to think about. I mean, like I've said this a couple of times before. Most of my childhood was, in fact, spent listening to classical music. My parents only listened to classical music. So,
Oh wow.
and weirdly, we only really listened to music in the car, and they listened to classical music. So I sort of, I would say up until like 8 or something like that, I really thought of uh thought of music as a kind of state, like an atmosphere, because it was just
Really?
this thing kind of hovered in the car, and
Yeah.
it wasn't something that was like necessarily actively listened to, but it was present. And that's an interesting. I mean, the more I think about that time now, I realize like, oh yeah, okay, that was the kind of non-functional but functional idea of music kind of was definitely seated in there. And this idea of, I guess, how I would think about something like some type of what you'd call ambient, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, the methodology was in that experience somehow. But then, like, when I got a little bit older, I mean, I had family members that were like listening to more like popular music, I guess.
Mhm.
And in terms of the one that I would say that I remember, I actually had this Beach Boys compilation CD called Summer Dreams. It was like
Nice.
yeah, I know you gotta love it, right? Um, it was the kind of, I think it was actually probably the first CD I owned, actually. And I must have got it for like Christmas or something like that. And um, I, I, uh, it was like the kind of CD you'd get if you went to like a strip mall or something, and there was like it was not bought at a music shop, probably bought at like a department store, like a sort of almost semi bootleg, localized bootleg classic that was, a cheap reissue of these things.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I had this record, the Summer Dreams thing, and I mean, I do remember a bunch of songs from that, but obviously, like, I mean, Good Vibrations is probably the song that I remember really clearly, partly because I just didn't know how it did what it did. And that I'm the
Yeah.
theremin and all that stuff. Like when you're a little kid, like
Oh
that
man.
stuff makes you think like, wow, what is that? How do you do that sound? You know?
Right.
And how do you get how do they get the voices so big? Like that's what I couldn't really get. Like how are the voices so, they're like I recognize them as an instrumental force in a way that maybe it didn't. Like with some songs, you hear a voice and it's like it's a voice that's telling a story, is a narrative thing. But there was a kind of orchestral. Maybe that's a tie back to the classical music, but there's a kind of orchestral vocal thing that happens in that song that's like far out. It's incredible.
Yeah. No, I think that's spot on. Like with something like this, yeah, I think that's a really good way of describing it because, I mean, it's one of the questions about lyrics. Like some songs, like the words matter. On something like this, the words are just a way for that instrument to sort of function or something. Because yeah, I Beach Boys are one of my earliest memories. Um, Differently in that my dad had Beach Boys records, and I would stay home on Sunday mornings when my mom and my sister would go to church, and we would listen to Beach Boys records and Bob Dylan records. And so, like, I remember Surfing USA is the one I really remember because I was like 5.
Oh yeah,
It's like, oh yeah, surfing, that's cool. Like,
yeah.
um,
And it's also a very catchy guitar line.
right,
So
but
that opening
yeah,
3 seconds is a killer, stone cold killer.
yeah. I, but that's I don't know. I really like that idea of like their voice, like yeah, their voice, this like orchestral thing because it is. I don't know, man.
I mean, I'm still fascinated by like the production stories of that period
Hell
of
yeah,
Beach Boys and the tape work. And I remember when I must have been like, I don't know, 2007 or 2008. Like there was a period there where I was going to Japan twice a year to play shows. And on one of the tours, there used to be, I think there's not so many around anymore, but for a while there were these incredible like bootleg stores in Japan where you could go and get like hundreds of bootleg CDs. And on one of those tours, I got this bootleg version of Smile that had like the 20-minute unedited version of Good Vibrations on it. It was like a kind of collection of stuff that hadn't come out. Smile wasn't released at that point. So it was before whenever that reissue happened. And I remember listening to him being like, oh my God, that's that part. Oh my God, that's that part. And you could feel all of these like really kind of like, they weren't labored ideas, but they were like fully executed ideas that then was like, we're going to take 12 seconds of this 3 minutes and make it this killer part that you're going to think about for the rest of your life. It's like, wow, that is amazing how you can think
Yeah.
about music, how think about like pop music in that way.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think about that. Gosh, I was talking to somebody recently on this. I can't remember what the song was. I think it was like a Daft Punk song. But we were
Okay.
just talking about like, just like sampling, and to me, and it hearing like, oh, I'm going to sample this song, but I'm going to take these three notes in totally different parts of the song and rearrange them to create this whole other thing. And it's such a, yeah, like it's a really fascinating way to think about production and songwriting even. I don't know. It blows my mind when I realize what those things. What?
Totally. It's also like one of the few good things on social media is those sample breakdowns where they show where they
Yeah,
take the part. It's like incredible. Daft Punk is
I
a really
know.
good one. I mean, like they've some of the just the simplicity of the choices is like exquisite.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Okay, well, totally different speed here. Well, okay. What's the song? First of all, do you consider yourself a crier? Do you cry often?
Um, no, I'm not really a crier, and I that look you if you talk to some people, they'd probably say I'm a little bit specky, but I'm. It's not that I'm not a crier. I tell you where I tell you what I think is really interesting about crying is that there are certain places and certain things that I think can trigger. I would say in the air, I'm far more susceptible to a like if I'm watching a film on
Oh,
a plane. My God, I don't know if it's the lack of
that's
oxygen or what's going on there, but
that's
it's a
a whole
power.
thing. That
Yeah.
is no, that is a legit thing. So there's a the podcast that I listened to that this one was actually very inspired by, which it's similar format, but it's about films. Um, and he talks about that all the time. Like, if I need to cry, I will just put on something when I'm on a flight, and it's like almost doesn't even matter what it is.
Yeah.
It's just
No, it's very true. There is a like I can also tolerate things in the air that I could never tolerate on the
yes,
ground at all. Like, the number of times I've defaulted to be like, yeah, okay, I'll watch Transformers the movie or whatever it is,
yeah,
like I would never choose to watch that on the ground. For a whole bunch of reasons. But like in the air, you're like, yeah, okay. Hey, a rom-com with Matthew McConaughey? Yeah, I'm going to give. I mean, if
yeah,
you give him one of his recent roles, I'm 100% there with the guy. But I'll go, sure, I'll go back to the '90s and see what that
right,
rom-com was like. Um, and yeah, it's very strange. And I will say this last couple of years where I haven't been touring so much and traveling, obviously with no one really traveling for a while. I did notice there was a gap in my filmic engagement that was around the stuff. I was watching things that are a bit more serious, and I thought, like,
yeah,
where's that light and breezy? I'm not getting enough oxygen vibe.
right.
So yeah,
It's this.
I feel that.
Well,
But I
yeah,
mean,
I
I
really,
do think I think there's certain things, even if I don't necessarily think it's about crying as much as like having a really strong
yeah,
emotional
absolutely.
response. And some weird way, I think it's like in Japanese, there's this word like natsukaishi, which kind of means like a nostalgia for a time that maybe you weren't actually present in. I think it's a kind
Mm,
of really poetic way of thinking about this, like a sort of unfulfilled longing, but maybe longing for something that you never knew anyway.
he's
And I
dreaming.
find in some circumstances, there's certain kinds of music that really holds that for me, and definitely certain kinds of films, like that Kurosawa film Dreams. It's like one of the
Oh
late
man.
period Kurosawa films. That
Hmm.
is such a profoundly emotional movie for me, particularly the Fox's wedding sequence and the orchard, the cut down orchard one. Those two scenes, I don't know what it is in those dreams, but that is, if I couldn't watch, I did watch that on a plane and it was
I was gonna say,
brutalizing.
I was gonna say, don't watch that
Weeping.
on play.
Yeah, weeping. It was absolutely brutal, but so beautiful. Um, in a way that, yeah, is quite
Yeah,
profound. And you see those things, you think like, it's like weirdly, I feel the same way watching like probably I don't know if it's my favorite film, but it's like definitely a film that I would think about a lot. This film Sans Soleil by Chris Marker. And there's this other film that Chris Marker made called AK, which is like his documentary about the making of Ran, the kind of 1984 period Kurosawa film. I find those two films make me very emotional as well in a way that is I find interesting because they're like a video essay, really. And the documentary is almost like an essay as well, a very caring one, but an essay nonetheless. But yeah, it's a curious phenomena, I have to say.
I really wonder, like, what the science. There's got to be some science behind.
Yeah,
Humans weren't meant to be that high in the air.
yeah. Oxygen wasn't meant to be that thin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
sure there's lots of stuff because I do find like I'm a parent and like I will find like parental situations in films way more intense up there. Maybe it's because of this sort of like the vulnerability of that state. That you're hanging basically with a giant tin can in the air, and that you're aware of the kind of mortality question is so present somehow.
Yeah, I think that's got to be part of it. God, don't ever watch movies in space. That's probably worse. Well, on that note, so what's a song that either in the air or on the ground kind of gets you in that space?
Like for me, it's like it's about harmony, I think. So I'd say like Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence by Rich Sakamoto. Sakamoto had a great way. I would say actually quite a few of his records, particularly at that sort of later period, like the Async and that last beautiful record that he made, they have this, it's a kind of space maybe, but that allows you to find your pathway in the, it's a harmonic space that's facilitated by the melody. I just find, I find he was able to it's almost like he's guiding you, but it's like, it's a really generous kind of guidance. Like, you'll find your own way into this state that I'm setting. And when you do, it's going to be with you forever, basically. And there's a kind of, maybe it's a little confident as well. That's like, I don't need to be didactic here. I just need to build the invitation. I know the invitation is strong enough that it'll hold you. You will be with it going forward. And obviously, the film as well is an incredible film still. And it's such an interesting thing to think about, looking at Bowie and Sakamoto in the film, for example.
Right.
And thinking about, who could do that now? You could have people doing it, but like that execution, all the elements is a very specific thing. And maybe it spoke to the kind of culture of like Japan during that period in the 80s, the sort of, high period bubble,
right.
This sort of sense of limitless possibility. And but at the same time, I guess they're kind of looking over the shoulder at what had happened in the mid 20th century and trying to unpack that from a lot of different angles. So yeah, pretty amazing to think about.
Yeah. Well, I got that song.
Imagine writing it. That's what I think about sometimes. I think like, imagine getting that melody and being like, oh yeah, that's a thing.
Yeah. Well, I think about and with Sakamoto, because he's, like you said, he's got a number of those. Like the number of times in his life he must have had that feeling of like, oh yeah, that's it. That's it. Yeah. Like I can't even. I can't imagine. I don't know. Merry Christmas is it's got to be one of my favorite melodies of like. I think Find Me in the Right Mood, and to sort of jump ahead here, I could think that you can make a case of this being like the greatest song of all time. Like, objectively,
it's a very powerful song. There is no doubt. I will say one time, one time I didn't have, unfortunately, I only got to meet Sakamoto a few times. I'm disappointed I didn't get to spend more time with him because I did think he was a very generous and like legitimately interesting person to spend time with. Like really considered. And I mean, my first meeting with him was very disarming for me, like I have to say. But we kind of corresponded a little bit. Actually, I wrote to him like just, I think like 9 or 10 days before he died. I didn't realize he was as ill as he was. And I just listened to that record and I just wrote him this little note. And he wrote the most beautiful reply. But there was a couple other times when we corresponded. There was one time we were corresponding around Christmas time, and he just wrote, and I could tell it was a bit of a cheeky thing. It was sort of like "Merry Christmas, Lawrence," and I could kind of sense this thing like you want to go for the whole hog, but you're not going to do it. You're just going to let me fill in that. There's some repeated lexicality there that is just I'm going to put in that little title. So anyway,
that's fantastic.
Yeah, it was very cute.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about Merzbow a little bit, but tell me the thing that puts you in a better mood, because I love this. I love this answer.
I mean, pretty much anything from Masami puts me in a better mood. But I mean, Pulse Demon, I will say, is one of those records I can always put on and feel better about it. Yeah. And I mean, it's a very particular record for him. I know, like, I think there's if you look at the catalog of Masami's work, you can tell there are periods where certain kinds of combinations of things that he's working with in the studio unlock a certain thing. And there's this period from in that mid-90s section where, like the one that we reissued, Noise Mass, which I also really love, and Noise Embryo and Pulse Demon. There's just this kind of like relentlessness in those records that is really, and this kind of really human, like performative noise, which I think is so particular to him during that time, and actually still now. Like it's such like they feel so heavily structured in a way, like they're very freeform, but there's just so much going on. You've got to think like that. He must be holding all that stuff together, but he's really an improviser. Masami is an incredible improviser, and he just knows the kind of scope of what the work is. But yeah, whenever I put on Pulse Demon, I always feel better. And actually, I can say this. I don't know if I've ever said this publicly, but when I finished I was working, so I did a PhD, and in the last 6 months, this PhD was kind of like the write-up period where you have to sit down and like, I'd written a lot of it, but it was just that kind of really mechanical going through it. And I listened to Merzbow pretty much every day for 6 months. And it totally broke my mind in the most useful way for dealing with writing. It was incredible. I recommend anyone else suffering a PhD out there, if your brain is anything like mine, put on Merzbow from when you start to when you finish, and you will find that the words just flow in a way that is quite unlike any other kind of.
That's fascinating. I don't know if my brain is like yours, but I know that because I've got a grant that I'm working on, and it's been a struggle. I'm gonna just put on Pulse Demon.
Do it. I had it with headphones on, not super loud, like just there.
Yeah.
And like it just because of that, I think it's partly to do with the way that he treats stereo in those recordings. Like some things are really hard mix up clearly, and that thing of winding in the auxiliaries or whatever, so you get this kind of like overlaying of material, like it's like the process and the original source are there together, and they form. I don't know. There's something in the way that he approaches the kind of material part of the sound, gesturally almost, that is really useful, I find, and very satisfying.
That's really interesting. Yeah, no, I can kind of see it. Like now that once you said that, because we all have some of our like go-to things when we gotta just crank through something. I for some reason, Merzbow never crossed my mind. But now that hearing you say that, yeah, man, I'm like, now I'm excited to try it out like later this week.
It might, it might take a couple of goes, but then there's a moment where it's like you're just inside it. It's not. You're not even. It's a different kind of listening that happens at a certain point because it's just so much. It's impossible to take it in, and I think that the kind of the opportunity to be so overwhelmed in that way, where you have to kind of just allow it to enter you, is really special and doesn't happen all the time. Like, I think that's the thing that, like, just very broadly, when we were discussing doing this chat, I suddenly thought about song and thought, like, well, it's weird. I don't always think about songs as a form, like, because when I think about songs, I think about that, there's, in some respects, there's like two schools, isn't there? There's like rhythm and melody, and then there's harmony and pulse. And I think Merzbow fits into the harmony and pulse school, and there's a certain kind of relationship there. And there are some people that can marry the two. I would say Sakamoto being a great example of that.
Right.
Someone that absolutely understands harmony and the kind of like the pulse of time, but at the same time can have this very melodic structure sitting within it. That for me is really rare to be able to do that. And I think what Masami does is, through using that approach, it means that you're in this other space. And for me, songs, I guess, default to rhythm and melody. And there's obviously lyrical components in that. And it's maybe things are serving a function, maybe, structurally. And there's that other side, the kind of harmony and pulse side. And you think about like Terry Riley or someone like that, there's obviously you can recount the melodic part of it, but so much of it is about what happens to your mind and your body when you listen to that work.
Yeah. Yeah. To bring it back, Terry Riley is one of my other go-tos, like when I need to, because it just sort of, if I need to get through something, just put on like Rainbow and Curved Air on repeat, and my brain,
that record is so incredible still. I mean, it's great. I mean, I'm a big fan of anime. People probably know that already, but I am a big fan of anime. And, when I was a younger person first discovering it, I had this VHS copy of Nausicaa, the Ghibli film, and the soundtrack to that, which is Joe Hisashi, the composer. I always remember there's this kind of intro section, this kind of electronic part, which basically is his tribute to Rainbow and Curved Air. Like, it's identical, basically, structurally and stuff. It's such a killer piece. Everyone should go and listen to it. And it's such a beautiful tribute. And then I always thought for years, I bet he was a big fan. And then last year I saw that he and Terry Riley got together in Japan and did like an NHK special. And
amazing.
It was just such a great thing to be like, oh, okay, I totally heard that. And I heard it as a tribute. And now I feel so good about the young version of me being able to recognize that there was some kind of like serious critical engagement with sound even early on. So yeah, and still a great film. Absolutely great film. Still thoroughly recommend. And the manga actually is even better. So I would definitely recommend the manga.
Well, we'll get into a bit more anime here in a minute. I'm going to kind of jump around here because, again, it's my show. I get to do what I want. And basically, I'm just going to like pick the ones where the stuff I want to talk about. What is a song, or maybe in this case, an album, that changed your perspective on an artist?
I can tell you one that like changed my perspective entirely, and I guess maybe on a form of music, possibly. Fear of a Black Planet by Public Enemy. I mean, I listened to that record not that long after it came out. I actually had, it's funny, somewhere I still have it. And I was trying to, like, often I go back to this period of like, because there was a time, and it still happens now, but like those early teen years, I think for everyone, it's such a period of consumption. Like you take in so much stuff. You don't even know how it's possible that you did marry up these really incongruous interests. Like they make no sense at all. You know, that you were, and I guess it's maybe that you just had really intense relationships with things. Like you deep dive on one after the other. And I remember I listened a lot to Fear of a Black Planet. And the thing is, like, I think when you're in North America, you can understand, like, as a 13 or 14-year-old, you can understand maybe because of the nature of the environments that you live in, you can understand the kind of social and political and racial things that are inbuilt into those records. But from down here, it's a very different perspective. And what I found so powerful about that record, it was in some ways, it was a gateway to understand the world was much bigger and that there were problems that were much bigger and that I couldn't fully understand at that point, but I knew that there were serious questions. And also just like, obviously there's a kind of overlay of what that record was about, like those radio samples that he used there. But then it's also like kind of the stories about HIV and that stuff that was in there. Like that was all really, like, in some respects for me, foundational for how I started to recognize that things were bigger. And I was really not necessarily aware of how big the world could be and how different the perspectives were. And that was really powerful. Actually, I interviewed Chuck D sometime must have been the late 90s or maybe it's the early 2000s, I guess. Yeah, it must have been like 2002, something like that, because we were talking about MP3s, I remember. But I actually got to basically thank him for that.
Wow.
And he was, I mean, he was very gracious about it in a way, but like, I'm sure he's getting people saying that to him all the time. But it was such a kind of like, I felt so positive being able to just relay that gratitude for what it was. Because, I mean, there was other work, obviously, that kind of was around at that time that also tapped into those things. But I think because of particularly just the shape of that record, it was so powerful, so directed, the way that the samples were used, the kind of like the production aesthetic, everything about it was like, holy shit, I've never heard anything like this. I've never thought about some of those, just even the skits that were run on the record. It was just, it's such a, and it's for me still, I'm really drawn to that approach in hip hop. I like the politic and I like the provocation and I like the restlessness and I like the aspiration that isn't necessarily, I guess there's kind of a little antithetical to from that same time, the kind of gangster thing. Like I definitely was drawn to that heavier, more socially engaged critique of 20th century America.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting that like you said, it kind of opened up your mind to your eyes that there were these bigger problems and this other, even, obviously I grew up here. It did that for me in a way too, because it was, growing up in Oklahoma, and especially like where I grew up in Oklahoma there was somewhat sheltered from a lot of those things. And it was like one of the first sort of cracks in that facade for me when I think when it came out, like I remember seeing 911's a joke on MTV a lot.
Yeah.
And thinking like, but that like pulled me in. And then my sister and I, like, we got the tape and she didn't really like it. And I was just, I couldn't, it was hard to get my head around, but it made me want to know more and know more. And I think eventually, like when I think about as I got a few years older and punk rock became like this very formative thing for me, like I can trace the intro, like it's a direct line from hearing this to like getting into the punk scene as a teenager here and all that. And so it's, yeah, I mean, there's some stops in between, but
yeah, I mean,
I think
there always
that's,
are, but I think those things, they hold, don't they? Like
yeah,
you don't, at the time, I think what's really good about it is sometimes, and I would love to think that all types of music can do this, but that what's really powerful about it is it showed you the gap in the world. There's this big space that maybe you can't even imagine, but it gives you this license to recognize that that's a place that maybe you should be imagining, that you should be recognizing those challenges that are outside your orbit at that point.
yeah,
And it's like not permission, but it's like it just gives you a window to look out of. And it's not the whole view, but it's that you recognize that beyond the frame of that window, there's a much bigger view. And that's super
yeah,
important at that point. And it allows you to recognize it's okay not to know. We don't know everything. We'll never know everything.
right.
And that other people's experiences are so enlightening and powerful if you can be open to listening to them.
Absolutely. And I mean, and I even think of now when a lot of the work I'm doing and different projects I'm doing that are more environmental related with sound. And I mean, music and sound there's this visceral connection that we have to them. Reading research and stuff about how sound is the first sense that we experience in the world through like heartbeats and voices. Like sound is the thing that is, and then there's research that says it's the last thing to go. And like for people, and so we have this connection to sound that can open our minds to things that maybe nothing else can. And like obviously something like this, like with Fear of the Black Planet, it's and the rhythm and the lyrics and all the production skits, all that. It's like it's very direct, but even more conceptually. I mean, I think about that with one of the things I think about a lot with the work I'm doing and with thinking about the sounds around like climate change and how these sounds are changing and how a big part of what I want to do is make people, not make people, but direct people or guide people to hearing things that they don't want to hear. Because the things that we don't want to hear are the things we need to hear. And it's having this conversation, I'm like, God, this is like, I feel like there's like this very winding path that traces it back to hearing this tape when I was like 11 years old.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I think that's the power of work, and I mean, I'm really grateful actually for those chance happenings. I mean, I actually don't know where I got this tape, where I got it from. And I'm always curious about how those things kind of happen. It's one of the things I really can't trace. There's a few things from that period I have traced back to a person or a thing, but like I have this tape, I don't know where it's from. But I know that I listen to it a lot because it's well worn. And I remember it so clearly. And like you say, I think we didn't really have MTV like you folks did. But I remember seeing it we had a late night music program called Rage here that ran every Saturday night, like 1 a.m. And then they do like a top, maybe it was Friday and Saturday nights back then, but they do like just random clips, or someone would program a bunch of videos and then they do the top 40 from like 7 in the morning or something. But it was so awesome because when you got good people coming through, they'd program these videos you'd otherwise never see. And it was so, it was like another one of those kind of like world openers.
Yeah.
And 911 as a joke was definitely one of the things that would crop up pretty regularly during that time. So
it was huge. I mean, it was huge. Like, here, it was so big, which I often wonder that. It's like that song. I mean, and even that song, like, is its own. Like, the message is, I think a lot of people maybe didn't tap into or whatever, but I think that it was like this gateway for so many people to, oh, well, I think this is cool. Like, this is fun. I want to listen to this whole album. And
Mm.
then it's like, if you let it, if you're open to it, it's just like you said, it just kind of whew, broadens this view of what's happening, what's possible, what's out there. And
It's also pretty like the shame is that so much of that record's still really current. I mean, some of those issues have
yeah,
been not, I'm not going to say resolved, but they've been like addressed, and there's like some shifts that have happened, but so many of them are like open wounds still.
yep,
It's extraordinary
yeah,
to think
yeah,
about.
yeah. I mean, this record
Think
is
that we're
nearly
still talking about the problems now, like, you know, four
absolutely.
decades on, basically. It's ridiculous.
It's absolutely ridiculous. And yeah, so okay, well, we're not gonna spend much time on this one, but I just love this answer so much that I have to bring this up. What
Sure.
cover song's better than the original?
Oh, it's easy. New York Groove by Ace Frehley.
Oh man, I never like I've never been a Kiss fan. I don't really care about Kiss, but God, I love like Ace Frehley. His solo album is a fucking joy, and I also love that when they all did their solo albums, his is so much better than everybody else's. That
Oh,
God, it must have
this
pissed
the
them
only
off.
one. It's the only
Yeah,
solo album. I mean, like, look, Paul Stanley has some fine songs. I'll give him that.
sure.
But it really is a record. It's like a proper record. It's like a solo record. You know,
Yeah,
every song is, I mean, mostly about Coke, but like good, you know?
yeah,
And New York Groove, like, it's the crystallizing of that version. I actually had an amazing, um, I used to buy a lot of bootlegs, obviously, because I've spoken about it a few times this chat, but like, I had this amazing Italian bootleg of New York Groove live, I think in Melbourne, maybe somewhere like that, when Kiss came on tour here. I still have the 7-inch actually somewhere. Had this quite provocative cover, and such a killer recording, and just like absolutely on point. Like I actually I've got a soft spot for Ace really as a, I mean, a kind of obviously a bit of a troubled character, and lately has been kind of a little off the rails, but like I think those songs from that period,
yeah,
um and the sort of like recognition of self-destruction was really like was a thing.
yeah,
Definitely a
yeah.
thing. So that's for me a very easy answer, I've got
Oh,
to say.
I love it. Yeah. I hadn't thought about it in a minute and kind of sent me down a rabbit hole. But yeah, that record is it's about the only Kiss thing I care about. I mean,
Yeah, and O
care.
did a great cover of Fractured Mirror actually on one of the records maybe like a decade ago, which I love that. But Ono Bachi's version of Fractured Mirror is killer, totally killer.
Yes, totally killer. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm gonna bring this to an end with one last question. This is my favorite question, which is, what is the song, or in this case, I think we're talking the whole album, that means the most to you?
Um, I mean, I have to, you know, when I read that, I thought, oh, that's a really interesting one, because I couldn't think of a song actually.
Yeah,
And I mean, maybe that's just me. Like, I think there are songs that I love, but I couldn't think of one song that like leapt out as a thing. But I will. I could think of an album that totally like I still love, and I still think about its impact in my life, which would be the soundtrack to Akira,
yeah,
which I still love as a film. And actually, I just reread the manga for the first time in like, I don't know, 20 something years. Uh, and it was better than I remember. Like Otomo, that work still. I mean, it's interesting. I've been thinking about it a little bit differently lately. Like, I wonder if I think it's somehow this ultimate expression of the power of Japan in the bubble. Like, at no other point almost could you begin to realize a film like Akira. Like, it completely revolutionized the way that animation worked in terms of the frame rate. The kind of like the structural, the cell work that was done, the key animation that was done, all the backgrounds that were done. I mean, in the studio, actually, I have on the wall a solograph of the final
Oh,
city
wow.
image that was just published by this wonderful gallery in Germany, which is like signed by the person that did the work on it. But you look at those films and you realize it's almost masochistic, I guess, the amount of work that went into it and the kind of obsessiveness that was happening. But when you listen to the soundtrack, it's so provocative, and I've been really interested actually in some of the. I mean, I love gamelan work, love gamelans, and the choice partly around that material for the soundtrack was to basically throw people off this idea of what the future was, like what the sound of the future was. And it was really efficient because, there was this real sense of like visioning during the bubble. You had like Walkmans and you had city pop and you had all these different kinds of like material and cultural manifestations of thinking about this aspirational future that was so specific to Japan during that time. And then you get this soundtrack that comes in and is totally antithetical to that. Like, it's like you're listening to music that is coming from another time. And I guess it counteracts and acts as a counterpoint to the film so efficiently. And that
Right.
relationship, how it's done, the soundtrack being recorded in advance of some of the key animation scenes, is just absolutely incredible. And I love the marriage, and I love the way that the music is so enmeshed in that marriage with the material content of the film. Like, the themes are so strong and they guide the film as much as the film guides them. It's a really rare
Yeah.
situation. I mean, there are beautiful soundtracks out there, like, that Cliff Martinez Solaris soundtrack. Love that thing. But it operates in its own space. Whereas
Sure.
there's something so embedded about the kind of audio visual language that they were able to realize with Akira that is just extraordinary.
Yeah, there's like no way to separate the two. Like,
No.
um, and that's amazing. I had no idea that some of it was even written and done before the piano. That's crazy. That's the scene. That's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you just, like, one thing I often am disappointed by there not being more opportunity for is risk. I think risk is one of those things, and risk and failure are two really important things that we need to embrace more. Like, we're so driven, at least here culturally and some other ways, about delivery, like always delivering something, which is totally okay. I get it, but it is very of the time. And I think this
Right.
opportunity for risk and for failure is so valuable. And the opportunity for failure in that process was just so enormous that
Right.
the success of it is that much more satisfying.
Yeah.
Remarkable, in
Totally.
fact.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, I mean, I just think about it with my own stuff, and yeah, like, you don't. There's just not the space to fail. I mean, there's not
Yeah.
to.
And
I
you've
mean,
got, it's about giving yourself permission sometimes to do it, to be
yeah,
allowed to. I mean, it's
yeah,
funny. I would say that the last two, like, I've been pretty slow on solo records, but both Approach and Cruel Optimism, both of those, there were two pieces that were essentially failures that ended up completing the record because I let them fail. And through having to reconcile what the failings were, something else got unlocked.
yeah,
This piece on Approach, which I can't remember what the title is actually, but I think it's like First Approach or something like that. But it was like incomplete, and I couldn't unpack it. And I went back and was kind of rereading, because this record was sort of about this manga grey that has sort of spurred on a whole bunch of kind of renewed interest for me in that sort of cultural stuff from Japan. And I remember rereading it and thinking like, oh, there was something about the way that this landscape was described. And I thought, I'm going to try and like bring that into the work. And like, because it had already failed, I had to completely rethink about how it was going to work. And that process of failing totally allowed this other thing to be, that became basically the way that the whole record was resolved around this one track. And that's amazing when that happens. But it's because of that willingness just to be like, not everything has to work. In the same way that not everything has to be, some things are just for us or for our friends. They don't need to be shared.
Oh yeah, I mean, thinking of things that have failed, this project that I worked on last year, the Sound Leaves project, just the process of it, so many things went wrong that just in, technical things or whatever, that I had to learn new things or make up new things to get what I was trying. And in that process, I mean, now that you say that, it's like funny because it's like just doing that and learning about these new things, thinking of these new things, it unlocks so many other ideas now that, again, I'm time, space, money, all those things, but like that I have that are kind of percolating in my head that would have never happened, never come to me if I hadn't had to go down this certain road. And that was a thing where the organization I was working with, they were basically like, we're giving you this funding and like we want you to do the project, but it doesn't have to look or be exactly what you said it was going to be. Like we understand that it's, things happen. And so in that way, they did give us permission kind of to like fail. I mean, they still wanted you to deliver something, but it was, you weren't held to this. You have this idea, you've had proposed this is what you're doing. And there's such a freedom in knowing that, okay, if it's not exactly that, like, I'm not done, or it's like, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes failure gets freedom. That's really, it's a thing. I mean, not all the time, but I would say in a great many cases, freedom, is it's there in failure. You just have to be able to recognize it, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Well, that is a beautiful place to end this on failure and freedom. Thank you so much for doing this. Selene is out May 31st. Is that right? I think May 31st. I
believe so. Yeah.
Which this may air after that. I haven't figured that part out yet, but everybody should go check it out.
Thank you very much for making the time.
Okay, that's it. Thanks again to Lawrence English for taking the time and navigating the weird time differences between Brisbane and Tulsa. We made it happen, though. So, go check out Selene, the album with Akira Kosemura, because it's a really beautiful record and one that's been a while in the making. It's one that like I've listened to it a number of times, but I have to be in the sort of right headspace to listen to it because there's a real, there's like a real emotive core to it that I don't know, I connect with it, resonates with me, and it's not like a difficult listen, but it's like it's really moving, and anyway, I don't know, I'm just kind of rambling on, but it's a great record. Just check it out. Room 40 is always putting out amazing stuff, and if you're not following Room 40, what are you doing with your life? All right, that's it. As ever, you can find me all over, wherever, Foxy Digitalis. You can support the cause at patreon.com/Foxy Digitalis. Or, hey, if that's not your thing, if you don't want to throw some bucks this way, throw them at Selene. Pick up a copy of it. You won't regret it. All right. That's it for this week. Till next time, keep on listening to whatever the hell you want.